Okay, now we are also live on Facebook. Maria, you have the floor.
Perfect. So welcome everybody to today's digital cinema on IGF Plus and the next generation of internet governance. This panel session is organized by the Institute for Internet and the Just Society and will be moderated by myself and by Konstantinos, who is the president of the Institute. The Institute for Internet and the Just Society is a think and do tank committed to a just and democratic digital society. We are pioneering an open platform that connects civic engagement with interdisciplinary research focused on fair artificial intelligence, inclusive digital governance, and human rights law in virtual spheres. We collaborate, deliberate, cultivate synergies, empower youth, and we work pluralistically, independently, and of course pro bono to find progressive solutions to the most pressing challenges for digital society. Our discussion today will be about the future of internet governance. Digitalization is taking place at a rate faster than ever before. And while this has opened our societies to a vast number of benefits, it has also been linked to a widening of the digital divide, to growing mistrust, to an increasing number of cyber threats and cyber attacks, to online violations of human rights, and even to the first internet-based drone war in Nagorno-Karabakh. So what is the way forward? According to the 2020 UN Roadmap for Digital Cooperation, of the key steps will be building a more effective architecture for digital cooperation by strengthening the Internet Governance Forum. And while there is general consensus in this direction, there's still a lot of debates going on how this will be implemented, with one of the options being the IGF+. This new structure will need to preserve a bottom-up approach, will need to further strengthen multi-stakeholders and to ensure the cooperation and participation of different stakeholders, not just public authorities, but also businesses, academia, civil society, and technical organizations. It will need to promote inclusivity and help overcome fragmentation in all the existing silos. And finally, and perhaps more importantly, it will need to facilitate turning discussions into policy and subsequently into tangible action. So together with us to discuss all of these issues are three incredible experts, if I may. Professor Wolfgang Kleinwächter, Professor Emeritus at the University of Aarhus. He's a member of the Global Commission on Stability in Cyberspace. He was a member of the ICANN board and served as Special Ambassador for the Net Mundial initiative. We also have Jorge Cancio, who is Deputy Head of the International Relations Team at the Federal Office of Communications of Switzerland, and who serves as the Swiss representative within the ICANN Governmental Advisory Committee and is currently on one of its vice chairs. And last but not least, we'll have Sorina Teleanu, who is an independent consultant with expertise in internet governance and digital policy, and amongst the many previous posts and important roles has occupied, has served as the chair of the executive committee of SEEDIG, the Southeastern European Dialogue on Internet Governance, as a member of the IGF Multi-Stakeholder Advisory Group, and as Romania's alternate representative to ICANN's Governmental Advisory Committee. So thanks to all of you for being here. It's truly a great honor to have you here. And yeah, so let's start the discussion. So Professor Kleinwächter, would you like to tell us a little bit about what's different about the IGF Plus and which established structures are being amended?
Okay, yeah, let's go back to history. So 20 years ago, when there was no IGF and there was only a very vague decision by the United Nations General Assembly to host a World Summit on the Information Society, the internet was an issue for geeks and freaks. So it was a technical issue. It was, for engineers and for youngsters who just wanted to discover a new world. And they had this idea, the internet creates a new world, creates a new society. If you read John Perry Barlow's Declaration of Cyber Independence, he said the kinds of flesh and steel, they should remain outside. We build a new world. And we discussed a new economy. So everything was new with the internet. Google was the small company, everybody's darling, don't do evil. There was no Facebook, no smartphone, nothing. But some people realized that this technical issue has some political implications. So 20 years later, we have to realize the world has changed. So the internet and all the internet-related issues are now a political problem with a technical component. So just if you go to the G7, to the G20, you know, the foreign ministers meeting yesterday in London, you know, discussed internet-related issues. So it's the internet is now in the center of international and national security issues. So cyber security is national security. The whole economy is a digital economy. So you couldn't imagine anymore the world economy without the internet. And if we discuss human rights, then we know that the challenge for human rights and the pressure comes from the digitalization with all these new forms of censorship, of mass surveillance, and all this. So that means our society, our world, our economy is now an internet world, an internet economy, and this has changed totally the understanding and the role of internet governance in the global ecosystem and in global policy making. While it was an affair for geeks and freaks 20 years ago, it's now in the center of policy making among leaders of states, heads of states, presidents, foreign ministers, military, intelligence people, generals, and the CEOs of all big corporations. So what does it mean for an institution like the IGF? So the IGF was established in 2005 as recognizing the fact that something has to be done, but at this time in 2004, 2005, nobody was clear what to do. So there were proposals on the table to establish a new intergovernmental organization for the internet, like a United Nations Internet Organization. And some people said, oh, this is very bad because this goes in the hand of governments. On the other hand, the internet was already there. It was managed by the private sector, and the Clinton administration, which established ICANN, and other like-minded governments said, okay, let the internet in the hands of the private sector. So private sector leadership is much better than governmental leadership. And in the conflict between the two concepts, you know, governmental leadership and private sector leadership, the idea of the multi-stakeholder model emerged and say, okay, the internet is too big to leave it in the hands of just one group, governments or private sector. And what about the users, the civil society and the technical community? So the best way to manage the internet is a multi-stakeholder model. And because we do not yet know all the implications, let's start with a discussion, create a discussion platform, not a decision, an organization which takes decision. So, and this was good for the moment, for 2005. So that means I was member of the WCIG, and our argument was also before you decide, you have to understand the issue. That means you have to discuss the issue, to take on board all the various perspectives, and then you can make a decision. But now, 15 years later, we know a lot about it. It's not new anymore. I think we have discussed all the details, and now we have a new situation that a decision taking on pressing issues, it goes from security to the economy, digital taxation, digital trade, to protection of human rights. You need more decisions. And insofar, the challenge for the future of the IGF Plus, and Jorge will be more specific in the next statement, so is to link the discussion layer to the decision layer. So the IGF has no mandate to take decisions. It was established for discussion for good reasons, because it said it's too early to make decisions 15 years ago. So, but now with all the knowledge, it said we have to make decisions. But the question is, should be decisions made by the IGF itself, or in this very complex ecosystem, shouldn't we develop some new decision-making procedures and to build a bridge, because existing decision-making bodies, we have a lot of bodies which take decisions, but not for the internet. So we have intergovernmental organizations which have a mandate to negotiate treaties. We have bilateral, plurilateral, regional organizations which take decisions. But this is dislinked from the discussion sphere. And insofar, the idea of the IGF Plus is to bring these decision bodies in a closer relationship to the discussion layer, which is the IGF, and this is what was labeled IGF plus. And we are in the midst of a discussion, you know, how to find the right instruments, the right format to build this bridge between discussion and decision. And so far, the proposal from Switzerland was, in my eyes, extremely helpful. And to say, you know, let's create a multi-stakeholder body which has a certain, not really a big power, but which has a renommé, a certain authority and legitimacy to bring a message from the discussion layer to the decision layer, and to tell the decision makers you have to take into account what has been discussed in the IGF. Jorge.
I don't know if you want me to take over. What's your opinion, moderators? Should I follow up?
If you'd like, feel free to go ahead and add.
Perhaps as a comment, we have to publish this very precise summary of the history of the IGF by Professor Kleinwächter in all possible media, as an infographic on Instagram. I think it was very much precise, and exactly what the history of the IGF is and the structure of the IGF plus. We would like to hear also from the other panelists if they would like to add something to this question. So what is new with this IGF plus structure? What does the plus stand for?
Yeah, maybe if I may, and perhaps we can change the order afterwards. And as Wolfgang put me on the spot, I'm really fascinated every time I listen to Wolfgang, all the history which is behind all this whole process. I joined it back in 2003, so I was more or less almost your age, Maria and Konstantinos, when I started with this crazy endeavor of the World Summit on the Information Society. And I was part of those discussions in Tunis. And of course, what Wolfgang said is everything is true. At the same time, we had, let's say that the IGF was a compromise solution, a typical United Nations compromise, because some wanted a UN body, as Wolfgang said, others wanted to leave it as it was, not don't fix it if it ain't broken, as they used to say. And there were others who said, we have to do something about this. At least we have to have a place to discuss, a table where to discuss this. How to discuss this was already a big debate to itself. And fortunately, we had the working group on internet governance between 2003 and 2005, where people like Wolfgang came up with the idea of the Internet Governance Forum. And in Tunis, at the end of 2005, we agreed on a very, let's say, ambitious mandate for the IGF, and you can look it up. It's still there. It's in the Tunis agenda on the Information Society, paragraph 72 and the following ones. And if you look at that, the IGF was really intended to be the place to discuss about digital policy issues regarding the internet governance. We didn't say digital or digitization at that moment, but really it covers very much. But it was a difficult start because it was a compromise, and still there were countries who wanted the IGF as small and as weak as possible. Other countries didn't really want to participate because they didn't like this bottom-up process and approach. And then there were others, amongst them, of course, many European countries who supported it from the very start as the place to try to to discuss all these emerging things that, as Wolfgang said, became more and more important, and nowadays are really indistinguishable from real life. So you don't have that nerdy corner where people talk about ICTs or internet, but you have it everywhere and every day. And of course, with the COVID-19 crisis, this has come more to the fore than any time before. But going back to the structures, in the end, if you follow this idea of form follows function, the form, which is the IGF, was thought for a period which was very different 15 years ago, but with a very ambitious mandate, with a very flexible structure and possibilities. And we thought, and with we, I mean Switzerland and many other like-minded countries and stakeholders from the private sector, from academia, civil society, we thought that we had to get the IGF up to speed with the times we are living. And we took the opportunity in 2017 that we were asked to jump into organizing the annual event of the IGF then, because there wasn't any other country organizing it. And we started to introduce some innovations together, of course, with the community, amongst others, that the IGF was opened for the first time by a head of state. At that moment, it was our president of the Swiss Confederation, Doris Leuthard, and other small innovations, just as, for instance, the so-called Geneva messages, which were a kind of a synthesis of what was being discussed at the IGF. And flowing from that process, which was taken further by the French organizers 2018, especially by the German organizers 2019, where Wolfgang played a key role. This idea of getting the IGF up to speed with the digital world became more and more dominant, more and more powerful. And we had all this high-level panel on digital cooperation process, which we can discuss later on. And it came up with the vision of an IGF plus. And the plus is really this vision, a vision of a more effective, a more inclusive, and a politically more relevant IGF, which is really up to the challenge of addressing digital issues in a multi-stakeholder fashion and being relevant also to the political decision-making and bridging that gap, which Wolfgang was mentioning, between the expert discussions at the IGF and then the actual decisions that are taken at so many other international organizations and processes, but also in multinational companies and national fora. So I don't know, I'll leave it by that and hope, I'm sure that Sorina has a lot to add.
Thank you, Jorge and Wolfgang. It's a bit difficult to follow up on that, but I'll focus on the more recent history of the IGF, if I can call it like that. And just for a bit of a disclaimer, I am working with the IGF Secretariat, but I am in no way representing the Secretariat here, though I might be a bit subjective in whatever I'm saying. So the IGF Plus, I would just like to add that it's not an abstract concept because it's already happening. When the Secretary General of the United Nations called for a strengthened IGF, or whatever words were used in the roadmap for digital cooperation, there were a few key terms there, like a more focused agenda. And we're already seeing it this year, for example. You might be aware that the MAG, the Multi-Stakeholder Advisory Group, has been doing a lot of work in recent months to try to come up with an approach for a more focused IGF. And this year, the community is invited to come up with proposals for sessions which focus on very, very specific issues. And it's everything on the website. I'll not go through them because, well, we'll never finish, but I just wanted to say that things are already happening. Then again, the intersectional activities are strengthened quite a lot, and Jorge can speak on the policy network on environments that the Swiss government is supporting. For instance, we're working on strengthening the dynamic coalitions. The best practice forums are continuing, and there is also a lot of effort put into seeing how these intersectional activities can feed more into the annual meeting, but also enable these connections between what was said before, the discussions at the IGF, and then the spaces where decisions are being made. So I'll just end on that note, repeating what I've just said. The IGF Plus is being constructed, built, whatever word, as we speak, and it's a matter of all of us putting our mind together to make it better, I guess. Thank you.
If I may add on that, Sorina is absolutely right. Let's say that the high-level panel set out a vision to address the gaps it had identified in its report to the UN Secretary General, which was very timely called The Age of Interdependence. And the roadmap, after a long, well, not so long, but an intensive consultation process, set some milestones or some broad elements to guide that process to an IGF Plus. But it's very much to the community, or there are many aspects. In some discussions we have said 99% even is really up to the community to improve and to put flesh on the bones of those elements outlined by the UN Secretary General. And as Sorina was saying, and Wolfgang and myself, and perhaps also Sorina, we were in a call just two hours ago trying to put more flesh on the bones of those improvements.
Sorry. Thank you very much. We would like to take a closer look to the, let's say, the executive, the administrative bodies of the IGF, and subsequently, and now the IGF Plus. So there's a lot of, there are a lot of voices that are in favor of strengthening, of making the IGF more strategic, let's say, more efficient. And to read from the United Nations Secretary General's roadmap for digital cooperation, with so referring to the multi-stakeholder advisory group, he asks to create a strategic and empowered multi-stakeholder high-level body, building on the experience of the existing multi-stakeholder advisory group. So, and that's a question for Mr. Cancio. How to make this, how can we make a body more strategic and more efficient from an executive perspective? What does the United Nations Secretary General mean by that?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question for Mr. Guterres himself. But at least from my point of view, this is in the context of this vision of an IGF Plus. So they are different bits and pieces which have to fit together, and this multi-stakeholder high-level body is trying to be one of the pieces to improve the IGF in its inclusiveness, in its relevance, and in its political visibility. And with political, I mean high-level visibility, both in the private sector, civil society, academia, all sectors, and in government. Not only in the government part. And if you look at the functions that are outlined in this roadmap, you see that those are aspects that in the high-level panel on digital cooperation were identified as gaps or as aspects which the IGF is so far not dealing as effectively as it probably could. One first thing is to address urgent issues. The IGF is good at taking emerging issues to its annual meeting, but things happen very much more quickly than that. You cannot wait for the end of the year to have the IGF and then have a very wise and very expert discussion on an issue. You have to address some urgent issues, and if you don't address them in the IGF, they get addressed somewhere else. And that somewhere else might not be as transparent, as open, as inclusive as the IGF. For instance, if you look back when these awful terrorist attacks in Christchurch happened in New Zealand, there was an ad hoc Christchurch call to get together governments and tech platforms and civil society to work out a plan to address this kind of live streaming of awful terrorist activity. And so that happened outside the IGF instead of inside the IGF, because the IGF didn't have the capacity, the instruments, the organization to address that. And I think that one of the intentions of having this multi-stakeholder high-level body is to be able to have a table, a permanent table with people who are at the right level, who can take action on such things. And if we look at the last year, we had a very good discussions in the IGF on COVID-19, but when addressing the immediate needs of COVID-19, people in the digital sphere, for instance, things as practical as video conferencing tools, which are sure, which are transparent, and so on. We couldn't wait for the IGF having that discussion in November. The discussions happened also elsewhere. So those are examples for that first function. A second function in the roadmap is to coordinate follow-up action on the forum discussions, and the related function is to relay proposed recommendations coming from the IGF to decision-making fora. And those two functions are very much related to this idea of bridging the gap between very useful, very valuable expert discussions we are having at the IGF each year, and then really the implementation of their consideration in the decision-making places. And oftentimes there is a gap between those, still there is a gap, and people outside the IGF community don't really benefit from all the insights, from all the synergies that have been identified during the discussions at the IGF. So this together with linking up with the intersessional work, which is already being done at the IGF. I don't want to bore you with all the acronyms, but we have intersessional work there who identify best practices, who now with the new policy networks will even develop recommendations. But for the time being, there is no direct connection with the decision-making places. And by having senior people in such a body, we think that this would be an added piece to link up the IGF better with all the other bodies which are relevant in this environment. But I could go on for hours, but I stop here for the moment.
Perhaps to as a follow-up
Sure.
to the executive function of the IGF, like to ask a question to Professor Kleinwächter. So, and to paraphrase a famous saying, if I want to call the IGF from the existing structures and bodies, whom should I call?
This is the famous quotation from Mr. Kissinger when he was the Secretary of State of the United States and he wanted to talk to Europe. And he said, whom should I call? So Europe is now a body with 26 member states. The IGF is a body with hundreds of stakeholders. So it's difficult, to identify the person because the whole internet has no decision-making center. And insofar, it's also good that the IGF has no one single point, which could easily become the single point of failure. So that means it's a distributed system with a lot of different constituencies and networks, as Jorge has just said. So this is the complexity of the information society, which is much more complex than it was the industrial society, which was based on hierarchies. So in the information society, the main structure is networks, not hierarchies. So we know that in each network you have also some hierarchies, and also in hierarchies you have networks. But the dominant organizational structure in the information society is a network. So, and insofar you have to be very careful if you want to change the nature of the IGF and to say, it has to become more relevant and it has to get decision-making power, because such a change of the status quo could also risk that you lose what you have. And the good thing with the IGF that number one, it's open. Everybody can go to the IGF. This is not the case in a very well structured and organized, let's say, established organization, whether it's NATO or it's the United Nations or the Council of Europe, where you have, much stronger rules of procedure, and you need these rules of procedure, and you need certain stricter organizational form in organization like this, the Council of Europe, NATO, or the United Nations. So the IGF is much more flexible, it's open and exclusive. The second thing is, if you go to the IGF, you can say whatever you want. So that's a place for freedom of expression. If you would start to negotiate text in the IGF, this would immediately close the minds and mouths of people, because then they have to consider exactly what they say. So that this would reduce the richness of the discussion. So if you are free to say everything you want, and then you can pull out from various stakeholders, you get really the full picture. So the weak point is in this very open environment is that you need somebody who has to find out, what is the substance, what we can take, from this broad discussion into the process which takes place in other well-structured, more structured organizations which have a mandate to take decisions. And here comes the idea which Jorge just outlined, that you have a number of layers. The whole internet is a layered system, as we know. So, and it would make no sense, to reduce the internet just to one layer and to organize on this layer. But if you, see the Internet Governance Forum, the IGF, as a layer, and then say on top of this layer, you need something else, and then you go to the next layer and the next layer. If you see this as a layered system, then you can also find, how to channel ideas which are, let's say, very, very rough ideas in the early moment, outcoming from this free discussion in the IGF, and to channel this into more organized processes and bring it to the decision-making table. It is similar to things, to a decision-making process in the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force. Here you start with a BOF session. So very early in the evening, somebody has an idea, And then, if you have enough supporters, you go to, you establish a working group. And then if the working group comes out with a recommendation, you go to a drafting team. And so you move forward step by step. And so with the IGF, if the IGF understand its role, that's on the ground layer and inspires other organizations. But somebody has to organize this inspiration and to, let's say, to bring all these ideas which come out from the discussion to the table where decisions are taken. Then you have the needed political relevance of the IGF. And this is the missing link. And the high-level panel has discovered this and said, this is a weakness in the system. So do not change the nature of the IGF, but add a layer. So this is also, the heart of the IGF Plus idea, that we say, keep it as it is, or keep the good things with the IGF, but identify where are the weak points and try to improve this and build this link to this decision-making layers. That means no negotiations within the IGF, but to have a bigger impact into the negotiations which are taken elsewhere and in a distributed system. So there is no need for United Nations Internet organizations that you negotiate all Internet-related issues in one body. So, but the various bodies should be also interlinked in a certain way. That means when the OECD negotiate, digital taxation, they should be aware what the United Nations discusses on cybersecurity. And insofar, the IGF could be also work something like a post office and to send letters, from one body to the other body to say, okay, if you make a decision on digital taxation, here I sent you a letter from the cybersecurity crowd that you understand what they are discussing because this is interlinked. And that's a big challenge. So it will need some time, but I think the roadmap is a good guide to that we move at least until 2025 into the right direction. Back to you.
Thank you. Sorina, I see you have your hand up. Do you want to add anything?
Thanks, Maria. I'm not sure still a good moment. I wanted to add a few more things on the multi-stakeholder high-level body, but if you want to move the discussion forward, I can just forget about it.
No, feel free to add.
Okay, I'll be as fast as possible. Speaking again a bit as an insider, I just wanted to make everyone aware that there has been a very open consultation on the whole idea of a multi-stakeholder high-level body. And some 80 stakeholders, including governments, have responded to that. And there is still a bit of controversy around the whole creation of the new structure. And this ranges from complete opposition, especially from some countries, to the whole idea of creating the body, to various levels of support from civil society organizations or private companies. So the Secretary General or whoever is going to make a decision on this is not going to have a very easy task. But it will be interesting for whoever wants to read more about the whole multi-stakeholder high-level body to read the summary of the contributions, because there is a lot there about how people see this new body and what functions it could or should have beyond what Jorge has said about linking the IGF with the decision-making bodies. For instance, there were some suggestions, a bit wild maybe, that the body itself would try to sort of transpose the IGF discussions into very concrete recommendations and then follow up how stakeholders are implementing those recommendations, while others were saying, well, that's completely insane. The IGF cannot do that, and the multi-stakeholder high-level body can surely not do that. So there is still a big discussion around that. It will be interesting to follow, and I strongly recommend the summary to everyone who wants to get a bit more insight into this whole thing. I can share the links somewhere, I guess, in chat. Thank you.
Thanks a lot to all of you. This was really interesting. Following up on that, I would like to hear kind of how do you see this translation of discussion into policy? How would you suggest that we should be moving on in your opinion, if not by having the MAG make very concrete proposals, policy proposals? Sorina, would you like to take the floor in that?
Well, again, I'm not sure it is on the IGF itself to follow up on whatever other organizations, body stakeholders are doing. As Wolfgang was saying, I still think the value of the IGF is this free space for discussions, for people speaking up their minds and saying whatever on whatever, without being concerned about some text being negotiated or some recommendations being drafted or these kind of things. So I would still say just, strengthen the IGF as it is, as a space for discussions, but make sure more people are there, more communities that go beyond the usual suspects and the communities we used to see year after year at the IGF, and then create these better linkages that we're talking about, and making sure that whatever is being discussed is then followed up upon, but without trying to create this kind of follow-up mechanisms. I just don't think that the space for the IGF.
Thank you. Professor Kleinwächter?
Yeah, I have two examples which I have used also in recent discussions, how the interaction between the decision making layer and the discussion layer could be enhanced. So number one is cybersecurity. I think we understand that cybersecurity is a delicate issue, which at the end of the day has to be negotiated among governments. And so we have the first committee in the UN General Assembly, which deals with disarmament and international security issues. And it would be totally unrealistic to delegate decisions on cybersecurity into the IGF. But we have a best practice forum on cybersecurity. So that means cybersecurity is an issue which is discussed not only among governments, it's discussed among academic people. So you have a lot of civil society organizations. The private sector is involved, with all these vulnerabilities in software and hardware. And so that means a lot of issues, certification issues, and the delivery chain and all this. So that means cybersecurity is now an issue which goes far beyond intergovernmental negotiations. So, and we had in New York, in the first committee, the so-called open-ended working group, which discussed norms of behavior of states in cyberspace to enhance cybersecurity. And they had a special informal consultations with non-state actors. And so in the best practice forum from the IGF came to these consultations and informed the governments about their deliberations. So, and this has made its way into the final report of the Swiss ambassador, Jörn Lauber, who said, okay, this has enriched the intergovernmental discussion. So that means if governments discuss, what would be the best way forward in, respecting norms for behavior in cyberspace, of enhancing, building, developing new confidence-building measures among states, that they, could make use of the richness of the discussion which took place in the IGF via the best practice forum on cybersecurity. So, and this has influenced the paragraph 4 of the UN resolution, which was adopted on 31st of December. I was not aware that the General Assembly works on the 31st of December last year, and they adopted a resolution now to have a regular institutional dialogue on cybersecurity until the year 2025. So it's a new open-ended working group. And they have in paragraph 4, an element which invites government or encourages government to interact as appropriate with non-state actors. So this is an invitation, in my eyes, from the intergovernmental sector directly to the IGF, and to say, okay, if the UN, the governments in the UN General Assembly, let's say, say it's good to have this interaction, then, the IGF could be, work much more targeted exactly to look into agenda of the open-ended working group for the next 4 years, and to make concrete contribution that finally, if governments decide on cybersecurity in the General Assembly and the first committee, that this richness of the discussion comes to the right place. So I think this is just one example how this could work. Certainly, if you have, as proposed by Switzerland, such a high-level body, then, you know, with the authority of, let's say, former ministers, CEOs, and things like that, which have also the legitimacy, you know, this pressure towards governments to take into consideration the outcome of the IGF discussions would be higher. So that means the effect would be bigger. So if it comes just from academic discussions, a lot of governments will say, okay, let's, the academics always have crazy ideas, they ignore it. So that means this is also to raise the authority of the messages which come out from the IGF when they go into the intergovernmental negotiations. Back to you.
Thanks a lot. So I'll get back to something you already mentioned and kind of discussed, this idea of the need of cooperation and the existing of different relevant fora. How do we prevent fragmentation, and do you perceive some sort of competition amongst the different fora? Jorge or Professor Kleinwächter?
As you wish. Wolfgang, would you like to take the first step?
Okay. You have always competition. That's very natural. And you have also interinstitutional competition. And so you had this in the 1990s between UNESCO and ITU, who takes the lead in building the new International Information and Communication Order. And so this is very natural. Competition is okay. Certainly, you know, forum shopping is a different thing. That if some groups say, okay, if I cannot get my proposal in this organization, I go to another organization. We see this at the moment with the Chinese proposals for the new IP protocol. You know, they proposed this in 2019 in a focus group in the ITU, and say the TCP/IP protocol for the internet is outdated. We need a new approach and a new internet protocol. And they tried first in the IETF. The IETF said, no, there is no need for a new protocol. We can develop this protocol on the basis of TCP/IP. Then Chinese took it to the ITUT, to a focus group on the ITUT. The focus group discussed it. It sent it to the ITUT study group 13. And the ITUT study group 13 said, okay, no, there's no consensus. And the rules in the ITU is if there is no consensus, then it's that. But now the Chinese paper reappeared in the IEEE, the International Organization of Engineers, so the same proposal, which is now renamed in now polymorphic networks. So now for new IP. So this is what I call forum shopping. So that means you have an idea, you want to push for it, and then you try and you jump from one organization to another. So, but that's the reality of life. So I think this is, we should not see this as really bad. So we have to be aware, and if there is transparency and we understand, you know, how certain groups are working. So the important thing is here transparency, and you discuss this and you concentrate on the substance. The other question, what you said, is fragmentation. So, and here I see we have to have a more differentiated approach to fragmentation. And this is what do you mean with fragmentation? Do you mean that the let's say the technical infrastructure, means the domain name system, will be fragmented and the root server system? Or do you mean that you have the internet fragmented into what we call now national segments? The Russian has introduced this terminology already 10 years ago and said to the national segment of Russia. So I never understood what a national segment is, whether if you have a register a domain name balalaika.com and you sell balalaikas to Russian citizens, but you have registered a domain name in the US, then is this domain name part of the national segment of Russia or not? So it's very difficult to find out what exactly the national segment is. But however, we see that national legislation is now spreading around the globe. Even the European Union is discussing and said we need European sovereignty, digital sovereignty for Europe, and adopting laws like the GDPR, which is not shared by other countries, but has a big influence. So this fragmentation is probably unavoidable. And this could be overshadowed by geostrategic conflicts between China and the US, that you have a Chinese internet and American European internet. So, but if it comes to the basic technical infrastructure, at the moment, I do not see an interest because of China or the US or Russia or India to develop an alternative DNS or to have an alternative route. So that means probably we live with a situation where we have an unfragmented internet on the ground because everybody is using it and nobody has an interest that this won't. They cannot use it anymore because this is unique to reach with one click 4.5 billion people. So if somebody would destroy this, this would be senseless for the national economy, even for espionage and other dirty activities. You need, let's say, a global network. So it makes no sense to destroy the technical infrastructure. But we will see fragmentation on the political level and probably also on the economic level. And with this walled gardens we have, that if you are with Apple, then you are with Apple and you cannot go easily to another. So if you are with Alibaba, you are with Alibaba and you cannot go easily back to Amazon. So that means this economic fragmentation and the political fragmentation will probably be in the years ahead a reality. But I have my doubts whether we'll see the internet fragmented on the technical layer.
Thank you very much, Professor Kleinwächter. Mr. Cancio?
Yeah, perhaps if I can add just on the question of forum shopping or competition. In the end, if you take a step back, what you have is issues which are looking for a solution or at least for a discussion at a global level. And you have many such issues which have to do with digital policy, be it identity, be it video conferencing tools, be it security, so many issues. And so there's a need to find places where to discuss this. And regarding the IGF, it's important that we improve the IGF in a way that we can absorb the discussions the IGF should cover. And this means the discussions which need a multi-stakeholder basis where everyone is free to discuss on an equal footing. Because the beauty of the IGF, something that is very hard to replicate in different fora, is that it is both multi-stakeholder and bottom-up, because that's the way it builds its program, its intersessional activities, and so on. And on the other side, it is also deeply linked to the United Nations system. So it has a multilateral phase. So this is something you will hardly find in other fora. And it is important that we improve the IGF so that it is able to address these issues, which are looking for a place to be discussed. They are looking for a solution. And if the IGF doesn't raise to the challenge, they obviously sweep to other places which don't comply with those sources, those two sources of legitimacy, which are so peculiar and so special to the IGF.
Thank you, Mr. Cancio. Perhaps focusing on this bottom-up future of the IGF, I have a question for Ms. Teleanu, also drawing from her experience at SEEDIG. How can we make the IGF more democratic? the first part was about how to make it more efficient from an executive perspective. Now it's, of course, we can have both simultaneously. We have to find the balance. But you had also referred to this initiative by Mission Publique, and I would like to ask you: do you think that direct, democratic, open consultations can enhance or not? I think I already got an answer, but please.
Yeah, you went towards that direction, but I'm not sure I understand why you see the need for the IGF to be more democratic, as in what is at the IGF that it's not democratic, because we have a bunch of open consultations about literally everything. The program is built in a bottom-up, open, inclusive manner, all these terms that we keep using. Everyone is, open to participate in discussions and meetings and whatever else. So I'm not quite sure I understand the need for more democracy at the IGF, also considering the previous discussions that the IGF at the end of the day does not make decisions. So it's not like only some people are sitting at the table and saying, well, this is how things are going to go because it's only us here. So maybe turning the question a bit back at you, why do we need a more democratic IGF?
I think it has a default structure. It's democracy by default, that we have this, that it's open by default and everyone can participate. But the other question is, will everyone participate? And as we've seen so far, you've also referred to these usual suspects that are always in this IGF, and there are the same groups interested and are the same groups bringing forward the agenda. So it's more of a question how to get more people interested in the IGF, and in this way to make it more democratic by expanding its legitimacy while having more people engaged and more people participating in the process.
So it's more about strengthening the inclusiveness of the IGF. I think this is a discussion as old as the IGF. We keep talking about the need to bring new stakeholders at the table. We keep talking about the need for more capacity development, more awareness raising. And I think there are small steps being made. We've seen, for example, the parliamentarians being brought at the IGF recently and some communities that have not been so much involved, but there's always room for more. And I saw Jorge had a hand. I think he has some things to add. So Jorge, over to you.
Thank you, Sorina. Yeah, maybe here I talk with my Swiss government hat on, but also with my personal hat on, because it's something very, very dear to my heart. Let's start with the personal part. In the end, citizen assemblies or citizen juries or whatever you call them are a complement to existing democratic structures. So you can use them in very different levels, local levels, regional levels, national levels, or supranational levels. And for instance, it was used in a way in the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. There was a citizens dialogue process. So what does this mean? It's a complement because it adds additional voices, and it adds the voices of the ordinary citizens to a debate which otherwise is more or less dominated by those who are organized interests, be it civil society interests in NGOs, or be it private interests, corporate interests, academic interests, of course, and government interests, which after all have to represent the public interest, especially if you talk about democratic countries. But I think it's an added value to this. And when we first met with Mission Publique in 2017, considering amongst other things that I had written a paper in 2009 about this kind of instruments on a completely private basis. It was a very surprising and at the same time a very joyful event that they came into this internet governance community. And we have been supporting these experiences because from a Swiss perspective, and here I put my more government hat on. Of course, multi-stakeholder is an expression of democratic thinking, where not only bureaucrats or government representatives take decisions and discuss, but also all other stakeholder groups are accepted to the room on an equal footing. And here Wolfgang could tell us very long stories about what happened to civil society and private sector representatives at the WSIS meetings in 2003 and 2005. And so multi-stakeholder is a step in the right direction, and it has some affinity with how we do things, for instance, in the direct or semi-direct democratic institutional framework we have in Switzerland, where you always have to find a consensus with all groups, because otherwise they can always kick down a law or a decision through a referendum. But that's a very important step. But I think that these experiences of having citizen dialogues from ordinary citizens discussing on an informed basis with a deliberative quality the issues that are relevant to us adds an additional value to our discourse, to our debates, and therefore we are very much in favor of institutionalizing these kinds of features in the IGF ecosystem. And for us, for instance, and going back to the start of our discussion, this is part of the plus. This is part of the IGF plus.
Professor Kleinwächter?
Yeah, this question has two elements. One is the outreach, and the other one is the multi-stakeholder, the future of the multi-stakeholderism. So if it comes to outreach, I have asked it myself also, why the Lisbon Web Summit has 100,000 participants? Why RightsCon, the conference which is organized by Access Now, has 50,000 participants? And we are very proud if we have, including online participants in the IGF, 6,000 or 7,000 participants that we had with the virtual IGF recently in the last year. So this is a problem. So one issue is that there was never any marketing action. There was no communication strategy for the IGF. And insofar, the IGF remained, as you have mentioned, a nice toy for insiders. So they were there and they knew it was like a family. So, so that means, but it remained limited in this family. It grew because we have this national and this regional IGFs. And if you count this together with the more than 100, Sorina, you know it better, do we have 120 or 130 now national and regional initiatives? I just recently was a speaker at the Russian IGF, and they told me that they had around 10,000 participants about whole Russia, only for this 3-day event in which was organized also virtually. So that means the virtual meetings will probably help for a better outreach. But this is one point in the roadmap in paragraph 93. So that means the IGF needs really a better communication strategy. So a lot of constituencies have no clue that we have this fantastic discussion platform for internet issues. And while they have, if it comes to business, they understand, or Lisbon Summit. So there is, this is a meeting for startups where I can make money or things like that. So this is attractive for a lot of people who never came to an IGF. But certainly the issues which are discussed in Lisbon, they have to pay 750 euros a fee. So the IGF is free. So that means you have nothing to pay. So this is a problem. and the IGF Secretariat, which is always underfinanced, so and had no instruments in their hand to do a better outreach strategy. This is part of the strategy, and this belongs to what Jorge said a little bit earlier. There are some strong players. I don't know whether it's in New York or elsewhere, which have no interest that the IGF gets strong. So they give the IGF a little bit that it does not die, but they are not interested that it lives as it could live. So this is a political struggle in the background, and I will not speculate who is behind this, but as an observer of this process for many, many years, so you see it, that there are some forces who are not interested into a stronger IGF. There are a lot of forces who want to have a stronger IGF. When Madame Vestager spoke in the UN panel just last week, she said, you know, the European Union wants to have a stronger and political, more relevant IGF. So, okay, what the European Union does, so probably to give more money into the IGF Secretariat, this would be helpful. So, but anyhow, this is the problem with the outreach. With the multi-stakeholder model, it was an invention, and the multi-stakeholder model is great. And I always argued against the senseless discussion whether it should be multilateralism or multi-stakeholderism, because the multilateral treaty system will not disappear in this century, but it's embedded in a multi-stakeholder environment. That means government are not the only players alone anymore, and they have to talk together and to work together with private sector, technical community, and civil society. And so, but in the multi-stakeholder model, so we have just, let's say, some general understanding how it works. So, but the whole concept has a lot of weaknesses. And in particular, if it comes to hard issues, then you see, you know, that the multi-stakeholder model has also its limitations. And, you know, what we see now, for instance, China is in favor of the multi-stakeholder model, but under leadership of the Communist Party of China. So the Russia says, you know, we are in favor of the multi-stakeholder model, but under Putin's leadership. So that means even in some European countries, they said, okay, if we consult with non-state actors, this is already multi-stakeholderism. That means the idea of a multi-stakeholder model is still in the early phase. And this is a challenge for the next generation, for Maria and Konstantinos and others, you know, to invest more in conceptualizing and institutionalizing all the multi-stakeholder procedures. That so just to bring all stakeholders on a table is very good, but it's not enough, and not for the future. So this has to be invented. So this is really a time for political inventions. So we need more creativity in policy making, not only creativity in building new services and applications which run on a smartphone. So that means you need also creative models, so how to make for policy making. And so the multi-stakeholder model has opened the door, but we have entered the room, but the room is still empty. So that means it has to be filled with a lot of elements. The Net Mundial Declaration was a good next step. So that means we have a better definition. What are the elements, bottom up, you know, inclusiveness, transparency, and all this. So that means conceptual elements are here, but not yet enough. Back to you.
No, thanks a lot. That was really interesting. I don't know if you have anything else to add to this, Sorina and Jorge. Okay, so then given that we are already past the 1 hour plus, just a last question, perhaps, what kind of advice would you give to the younger generation involved in digital governance? And what challenges do you think they should be focusing on and trying to kind of tackle? And maybe a last thing is looking back at the first time when you were involved in internet governance. So what do you think has changed since then? What kind of challenges did you face at the time?
I can try to start.
Go ahead.
Starting from your last question, well, I started with internet governance some 15 years ago, which sounds like ancient history. I think what has changed a lot is the focus on trying to bring more youth on board. And now you see all these capacity development programs and all these initiatives starting from the IGF with the Youth IGF track and with the Internet Society Fellowship programs, ICANN Fellowship, Schools of Internet Governance, and all these things. There is a lot more focus now than 15 years ago on trying to get more youth engaged into this whole discussion processes and organizations. So if I were to give an advice, it would be just find these opportunities, whether it's at the national level, a national school on internet governance, or a national IGF, or a regional one, or an international one, or whatever. Just start somewhere and then find your way. We have in the region, if we speak a bit about Southeastern Europe, quite a lot of opportunities, and I'm extremely happy to see the students of our region applying to our schools of internet governance, contributing to our regional IGFs, and really not just, showing up once and then saying, well, I've done this, now what next? But they stay engaged and they bring value to this whole processes. So that would be it from mine, and just find the starting point and then keep adding and contributing to these things, because at the end of the day, it's building our digital future. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Teleanu. Mr. Cancio?
Yeah, maybe we go in order of veteranity, if we can say that. Yeah, as I said before, I was first involved in WSIS in this internet governance world in 2003. I was coming from the telecommunications lawmaking world, which was much more mature at that moment than the information society, as we used to call the digital realm. And yeah, of course, what then that was a promise and a very nerdy subject, and now it's everywhere. It pervades our hybrid world where everything physical and digital is merging and becoming indistinguishable. So that's been a huge leap, and probably my generation is the last generation which witnessed a world without internet, without even computers. So computers was something to play with and wasn't connected to anything. So it's been a huge leap, and maybe it's even difficult for you who are much younger to understand how that has changed. As to an advice, I wouldn't dare to offer an advice to younger generations. I think every generation has to fight the world, integrate into the world, and change the world as far as possible. And you have to, I guess, challenge our generation, older generations, challenge yourselves. Think out of the boxes, because the boxes have been developed by somebody before, by those guys who were there in Tunis in 2005, or by people who were there some years later, and take your own ownership and responsibility as far as possible. And as Sorina said, there are plenty of places where you can walk in and start talking and start discussing. And it's very much on an equal footing. And I think the host country for 2021, Poland, is very eager to integrate youth into the IGF discussions. And of course, at least from our side, from the Swiss side, we will always support that happening, and not being just a token participation, but a really participation which is mainstreamed into all the activities of the IGF fora in general. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cancio. And last but of course not least, Professor Kleinwächter. You're speaking now to the younger generation, and reminiscing the time in the WCs and in the Net Mundial. What's to hope for the next years? Okay, thinking out of the box is a good advice. But my first dealing with this issue goes back half a century. So because I'm already in my 70s, and I remember that it was in the early 1970s when I was a graduate student. So there started a discussion in the United Nations on television via satellite. So direct broadcasting satellite television became a very controversial issue. The world was divided into the three worlds. So we had the Western democracies, we had the East Bloc, which was very critical on Western media, and we had the third world, which was also not so happy about what was called cultural imperialism at this time, that they get all the information, from the Western countries. They wanted to build their own countries. So, and this took place in the 70s in the United Nations in the Outer Space Committee. And this has pulled me into the issue of transporter data flow. Because, this was fascinating for me as a graduate student to see that at this time it was unimaginable that you can move an information, with one click around the globe. So it was very difficult, to go across frontiers with information. So with the Berlin Wall in between, that was also a wall which, separated information. And so transporter flow of information, free flow of information, became a driving force. And so I was pulled naturally into this internet world already in the 1980s, before Tim Berners-Lee invented the World Wide Web, which was the starting point for all the applications we have today. So, but looking forward, and it's always difficult, to speak about, what will be, how the world will look in 5 or 10 years from now. So, but I remember, and Jorge was, I think, there when we had an ICANN meeting in San Francisco, and the ICANN invited the former president of the United States, Bill Clinton, because ICANN was established under the Bill Clinton administration. And so, they invited him to give a speech. And what Bill Clinton thinks about the internet and internet governance, I think it was 10 or 15 years ago. And Clinton said, okay, when I was the president and the internet came, so he became president in 1993. And this was the moment when the dot-com boom started. He said, the US was confronted with a big economic crisis. And suddenly we see that the internet is coming. And our reaction was, okay, let them do whatever they want. Probably they will help us to overcome the crisis. And then he said, okay, we had no clue so how far this will go with the internet. It was really exploding. And then came some people and said, okay, here we have the domain name system, something good should be done. We need internet governance. This was in 85, 86, and 95, 96, and 97. So he said, okay, let's do it. And then he summarized this experience and said, if I look today at what internet governance is, he said, there is no silver bullet. There is no one size fits all. It's like stumbling forward. And he said, as long as it's forward, that's okay. But it's really stumbling. You enter new territory and you have to find out what it is. Insofar, I can only repeat what Jorge said. Each generation has to find out, what is the best way. So it's a very exciting territory which is ahead of us. And so the next 10 years will be exciting, but the 2030s will be probably more exciting. And so that means that you have a good luck to move into a very interesting future. Thank you very much for this wonderful conversation to all of our esteemed panelists. Thank you so much for your straightforward answers also to ambiguous issues, and also for this look forward to the what's coming ahead. So we fasten our seatbelts and get prepared. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
So, bye.
It was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Bye. Bye. Have a good
Thanks
day.
a lot.
Bye-bye.
Bye.